It has been a tumultuous month for Bitcoin. The digital currency saw its largest exchange, Mt. Gox, suspend trading and shut down amid rumors of theft. Then last week, the Alberta-based exchange Flexcoin saw $600,000 worth of Bitcoin stolen. Joining us now to help us understand what this means for the future of this digital currency, Tim Richardson, who teaches e-commerce at the University of Toronto and Seneca College. And we welcome you back here. You were in here not too long ago talking about this very same topic. And again, because this is so new to so many people, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves off the top here. Bitcoin is what?
Digital cyber currency.
Digital cyber currency.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an analogy. It's like Canadian Tire money. We're in the head office of Canadian Tire, so maybe we can use that reference. But people have Canadian Tire money in two different ways. They have physical denominations of the dollar and the 50 cent, the 25 cent. But if you use your Canadian Tire MasterCard, you can also accrue money on the card. So it's more in the concept of a digital acquisition of a currency that you can use to spend.
So I can't hold a Bitcoin.
Well, you could physically, but a single Bitcoin right now today is trading about $691 Canadian. So it'd be a very valuable piece of metal. So in the cyber context, they're digital, and you possess and hold them in what we call a digital wallet.
How popular has it become?
Well, it's become quite popular, but there's also been a lot of criticisms. At the same time, if you want to look at it in terms of transactions, there's about 80,000 transactions a day of people using Bitcoin. Now you may think that's
computers.
Yeah. Now you may think that's a lot, but if you compared it to something like, say, Visa credit card, that's about 2,000 transactions a second. But still 80,000 a day, that's a lot of transactions.
But pales in comparison to the rest of what we're used to, what we're accustomed to.
Yes, indeed. Now the other thing too about the Visa transactions, it's based on a currency which is recognized by a sovereign country. So it's US dollars, Canadian dollars, Japanese yen. Bitcoin is not associated with a country, it's in and of itself. So that's the other thing that's different about Bitcoin to other currencies.
It's not, I understand that, it's not made or connected to a national currency per se.
Yes.
But does the government of Canada, for example, recognize that Bitcoin is a legitimate currency?
Well, it recognizes, but it doesn't, you can't pay Canadian government services with Bitcoin. That would be the ultimate recognition of it. And there's a number of different governments around the world that are different stages of recognizing and not recognizing. So the Chinese government had recognized it for a short time, but then decided not to. The US government, Secret Service, which also deals with currency fraud and other things like that, is very concerned about Bitcoin. Representatives from Bitcoin had met with the UK government and the German government, but it's doubtful whether that relationship is going to continue. It's a very nebulous thing right now.
Okay, but bottom line, it's not illegal, obviously. None of these governments has made the use of Bitcoins illegal.
Correct.
So they must think there's some value in them.
Well, there is what people do with it, though, that is considered to be illegal. The possession of that currency as a fraudulent transaction for a criminal activity, that would be considered illegal.
Gotcha. I've never seen one of these, but apparently in downtown Toronto, there's an ATM at King and Spadina. If you're from out of town, you might know the neighborhood. You can buy Bitcoins at this ATM. Have you ever done this?
No, I haven't.
You haven't done it, but there's, I mean, take a look at the shot there. You look in the monitor here in the studio. That's a Bitcoin ATM. People can go up and purchase Bitcoins from this thing.
Yes, but they don't get a physical piece of metal, which is worth $691. They can walk in a store and buy something that's worth $691. It's a digital thing that they can either keep that instrument with the identification of the numbers and so on, either on their smartphone or their computing device or whatever it is that they use, and then use that to exchange for somebody else who wants to trade.
So if you were to go to a store that said, yes, we accept Bitcoin, you show them your smartphone, you show them how much you've got in your virtual bank, and then somehow transfer those Bitcoins to the retailer.
Now the difference between that and say Canadian Tire money or some other currency which is not denominated according to the country from which it's operating in is that the Bitcoin value changes quite a bit. So that would be like a Canadian Tire dollar, which all of a sudden became very, very popular, and there was a fixed amount, say 21 million. And instead of that having a face value of $1, I could give it to you and you would give me $2 worth of things because Canadian Tire money had become more valuable. That's the way of using an analogy to explain the popularity and rise of the value of Bitcoin.
Okay. Tim, one of the reasons we have you in here tonight, obviously, and we're talking about this now, is that Bitcoin has been in the news a lot lately and for all the wrong reasons. Mt. Gox, one of the largest Bitcoin exchanges, they lost 850,000 Bitcoins, then valued at $450 million. The company blamed the loss on a transaction malleability. What does that mean?
Well, one of the problems that Bitcoin suffers with is the secrecy that surrounds the origin of Bitcoin, the secrecy that surrounds the identification of the person that started this software structure, et cetera, has been so pervasive that it makes it difficult to give credibility to the way you look at this situation. And the particular circumstances that you're talking about cause some people to feel very uneasy about the length of time which Bitcoin is going to continue before it all comes crashing down. There's so many different angles to this story, whether it be a malfunction of the basic structure of how Bitcoins are mined, or it be the integrity of the people who authorized the transaction in terms of how you identify the different process of the Bitcoin mining.
I think that was it in this case.
Yeah.
There was a bug in the system that allowed, virtually speaking, as money moved from one virtual wallet to another virtual wallet, the thieves got in there and stole it.
Yes.
$450 million worth. That's a problem, I presume.
It is indeed.
And then last week, they shut down the Alberta-based FlexCoin. Now it's $600,000 in that case. It's not so much. But do they have a problem here?
Well, yes, they do.
I mean, beyond these one-off examples, is there a more structural problem here?
Well, there is indeed. And you also have the picture being posted of Satoshi Nakamoto. Is that really the person, or is it a person that just happens to have the same name and so on? So this all goes towards the credibility of the currency. When you look at other currencies around the world, they're associated with the sovereignty of a country and the economic base of that country and its buying and selling international trade. When Bitcoin doesn't have that as a background, it makes it problematic. So it's based on people believing that the way the coins are actually mined with people that use $20,000 computers is a credible process. And when these two instances that you explained happen, then it shakes that credibility.
It shakes the credibility, sure. So can you talk a little more about what kind of an impact, when the Mt. Gox thing happened, which was a huge sum of money, what kind of impact did that have on the value of the currency after that took place?
Well, it dropped several $100s in one day. Now, it went down in the range of the 400s. I think it was around 470 or something like that. But today, I just checked my Onyx. It's up around 691. But still, that's quite a bit of volatility. And people who are currency traders don't like that. I mean, the Canadian dollar doesn't go in that range. US dollar, Japanese yen doesn't go in that range proportionate to what it's used for. So that causes people some problems.
When a currency is entirely digital, is hacking inevitable?
Well, you can hack just about anything if you describe the word hacking as being able to figure out how something works. Now, when I said figure out how something works, one of the problems is the identification, who are the people that set out the structure of Bitcoin in the very beginning. This anonymity has become almost a legend in the community. And some people think it's kind of neat because it goes towards the credibility of the process, and they think that somebody hasn't got an axe to grind by faking it. On the other hand, because that can't be validated, then people are trying to ascertain the truth about the situation.
We're going to get to Mr. Nakamoto in a few minutes. Hold on for a second here. If you were to go into a bank and say, I want to take $100 out of the bank, you've got stuff you've got to fill out, you need some identification, you have to have an account there, there's ways of tracking all that stuff. How anonymous are Bitcoin transactions?
Well, they are and they aren't. It depends on how you describe the actual process. The anonymity of the people that hold the Bitcoins depends upon the identification of them in terms of the contact information and so on. That's a nebulous circumstance. What makes Bitcoin valid is that you have a lot of people who are identified as credible part of the processes. And as I'm bidding to trade a Bitcoin, this person says, yes, that's okay. This person says, yes, that's okay. And that validates the credibility. So there's an understanding that that particular unit that's been exchanged is credible. But the other part of the anonymity means that sometimes people who are trying to possess and trade and identify can't establish that because of the structure of the way things are happening.
But if this all happens on computer, if somebody steals, as the money is moving from one virtual wallet to another virtual wallet, and it's being done by a computer, presumably you can track down the computer that stole the Bitcoins, can't you? I mean, everything leaves a footprint now.
To some extent. I mean, there's a case recently where a guy was alleged to have had a very, very large quantity on his PC, and it accidentally got thrown in the garbage. And so he went to the garbage dump, and it was buried under many, many meters. And he tried to get in there, and it would seem to be impossible to try to physically get access to that hard drive. So that's one of the problems.
So the Bitcoin actually doesn't live in the cloud, it lives on your individual computer?
Yeah.
Which is why you'd want to hang on to that computer for dear life.
So that's one of the vulnerabilities. Every chain has its weakest link.
What can a Bitcoin user do to protect their Bitcoins from theft, besides just taking good care of your computer?
Well, some of the things you apply to other circumstances. Social engineering is one of the things that has led to a lot of identity theft situations with credit card information, PIN numbers, et cetera. And that's some similar context of the way people are vulnerable in Bitcoin. So it's not about Bitcoin's weakness, it's about people who are vulnerable through social engineering that relates to all the other different sort of IT and computing devices that we have.
Gotcha. Do you have any idea who was behind the Mt. Gox heist?
No, personally I don't.
Does anybody?
I think it's difficult. I think it's technically difficult. I think within the Bitcoin community it's difficult because to identify someone like that and then to have that problem be aired in the media and have the media ask many probing questions goes towards the credibility of the whole big structure. I think the basic principle behind Bitcoin is a good one, but there's so many challenges to other things that have nothing to do with Bitcoin itself that leads me to suggest that something that comes along in second place later on, looking at Bitcoin's mistakes, will end up taking over and be more popular.
Do law enforcement authorities, because this is not, after all, legal tender according to the Bank of Canada or the Fed in the United States, do local law enforcement authorities care that these things have happened, and are they therefore investigating them?
Yes, they do. I'll give you one perfect example. I just happen to have a $100 bill in my pocket here.
Now that's real money.
Yes, this is.
A real
looks
legal,
kind of plastic.
Legal tender from the Bank of Canada.
If I was a bad guy and I wanted to pay for something, $1 million would seem quite reasonable, whether it be drugs or some contraband or whatever it might be. If I wanted to pay for something that was worth $1 million, which is not a lot for a bad guy, how many $100 bills do I need? I need 10,000. How much does $100 weigh?
How much does $100 weigh? Nothing.
How much does $1 million weigh of $100 bills?
Something.
About 22 pounds. So if I had 10,000 of these in little piles or on our table here, we're talking about a pile this big. Maybe, say, 5 or 10 economics textbooks.
So that's problematic for your average criminal.
Try to strap that around your chest and run across the border. Now, $1 million is really not a lot for bad guys. 5 million, 10 million is more like it, which is a couple of 100 pounds. So this is one of the reasons why criminal organizations of all different types are wanting to use some type of cyber currency in 2013, 2014, and happens to be Bitcoin, but whatever comes along next will also be exploited in that way. Blood diamonds are also kind of sexy, but it's a geographically oriented product and the physical movement of them is more tightly regulated and so on. But Bitcoin right now is attractive.
Okay, I hear you, but the difference is any criminal can take that legal tender and spend it anywhere on anything that they want.
That's right.
You can't do that with Bitcoin.
No.
So why would they go for it?
But if you have the expectation that the value of Bitcoin is going to increase and increase, one of the reasons why Bitcoin has so many trades per day is it's not people buying products with Bitcoin, it's people trading them to other people who have speculation about the future rise in the value of Bitcoin. So, and the other thing too, which is a bracket of this, is the types of crime that are exploding. We don't have as many violent crimes, and many police forces in Europe and North America talk about the decline in violent crime and the aging population and so on. But we have an explosion in identity theft and all the things related to that. And part of it has to do with the proliferation of handheld computing devices and smartphones with more and more applications, and identity theft is just an easier crime to perpetrate. You marry that with Bitcoin, and that's an explosive situation.
Don't misunderstand here. I'm not accusing you of anything here, particularly not being a criminal, but do you trade in Bitcoins?
No, I don't. I'm not a miner. The slang expression for people that have a $20,000 or $30,000 computer and run the software, basically connecting all these component parts. And if you used, say, the analogy of playing a crossword puzzle, or not a crossword puzzle, but a picture puzzle. And as you put the parts together, you create value. And that value then could be used by you to trade for something, or it could be bought by somebody else. So as a picture puzzle comes together, somebody says, yes, Tim put this piece of puzzle in, and that's the validation process.
But you know about this stuff and obviously find there is legitimacy in it.
I find it fascinating.
You're interested in it, but you don't want to participate in it.
Well, because as we use more and more mobile devices, we're going to have further developments of things like this. And as we talked last time off camera, I said to you, is Yahoo a verb or is Google a verb? So I think Bitcoin's great. But in business and marketing, we talk not only about the first mover advantages, but also the second mouse gets the cheese. So what's coming along second after Bitcoin is going to look at Bitcoin's mistakes, and will even have further advantages.
Gotcha. You mentioned earlier in our conversation here, this fellow Satoshi Nakamoto, who is thought to be the guy behind all this. 64-year-old man, Japanese, allegedly the founder of it. Does anybody know if, in fact, he's the real guy who did this?
Well, you're asking me as a person who studies Bitcoin. I'm not a Bitcoin expert, but I studies Bitcoin, but I also happen to know a little bit about Japanese culture. Lived in Japan, speak Japanese. I would not like to say that he is or isn't, because that's a very complicated situation. But the choice of that word for him has many ramifications if you look at Japanese culture and Japanese history. His name, the actual components of his name, Satoshi, what it actually means in Japanese. And the reason why you would pick a person like that, say, versus a Korean or person from Latin America or so on. So there's all kinds of ramifications. And the Bitcoin community has a whole culture of exchanges and chats on forums about this very question of the identity of that person.
What does his name mean? Does Satoshi Nakamoto mean something?
Yeah, just like many Japanese names mean something. You know, Middle River, Middle Forest, Small Forest, etc. They all have some meaning, which has references to Japanese culture and other circumstances.
So if you were betting, you'd say this is a pseudonym for a real guy, not necessarily his real name.
That would be my personal opinion.
And why would the founder of something that clearly appears to be taking off and gaining legitimacy, why would he want to stay hidden?
Well, some people have said, I'm not saying this particular person, but some people that create a structure that can be used for criminal activity can then find themselves later in a very advantageous position to take advantage of that. So he's been outed if he was the founder. If he's not, then he's still private, then he can still continue to be involved in things. But if I personally was the person that founded Bitcoin, I wouldn't want anybody to know who I was.
Why not?
Well, there's a number of tactical reasons for the future evaluation of the coin. And plus the fact that there's a maximum of 21 million to be mined.
I'm not following. Wait, if you...
Well, the mathematics of the Bitcoin structure is that in the future there will be a maximum of only 21 million Bitcoins. If it continues to appreciate in value, then the person who was involved at the very beginning could conceivably be extremely wealthy, as long as the rest of the world buys in for micropayments and smartphone devices start using this and so on and so on. So it's a very, very long-scale forecast for this type of currency.
But we have a culture now where everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame and be on the cover of Time magazine or whatever the equivalent is.
It goes against that, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Indeed.
And yet, here we are. Many Bitcoin users, it's not a cult, is it? It's, what would you describe it?
I would say it's a cult. I mean,
it is a cult?
I've been accused of calling iPhone users a cult. I mean, if you say something about them, they're not quite as rabid as a Galaxy or the Google or the other phones.
Well, Newsweek did this big takeout on Satoshi Nakamoto, in which they named him.
And they took his picture.
And they took his picture and they put it out there. They published it. 4,700 words in their cover story. And many Bitcoin users are apparently furious with Newsweek for outing Nakamoto. Why the strong reaction?
Well, it's almost a proprietary way that they think about Bitcoin as a culture. There's a lot of things people like about Bitcoin, people who are miners and also people that use it. They like the fact that it's outside the sovereign economic entanglements of a country. So for people that are preppers, for people that don't like government involved in the face, a lot of Americans that are dealing with cyber instruments like this, it's a very attractive thing, culturally speaking. So if you out the founder, it's like the emperor has no clothes. It's a kind of unattractive thing, because all of a sudden then he can be challenged as to particular questions. Well, why didn't you do this? And why did you do this? So if he's not outed, if his privacy is kept private, then they continue to have these fantasies about the reason and therefore of all the different circumstances.
This thing requires some buy-in of fantasy for it to work?
Well, it requires a confidence in the way that the original thing was set up. And if everybody has that confidence, then it works.
What has the guy actually said? I mean, they did show his face. Has he ever done any interviews?
Well,
Anybody ever seen him?
He has consented to understanding parts of Bitcoin and consented that he was, subcontract is a bad word, but that he was working on some parts. But he said in no circumstances at all was he responsible for the whole thing. So that's his rejoinder to these accusations.
Don't you find that odd that he would want to deny that he's the guy behind it, given how everybody wants to be known and famous for something?
But there's enough accurate information exposed about what he did in his background that he had to confess to being part of it. So that's the way he had to answer that question.
Okay. Let's go back. These events took place, the Mt. Gox thing and the thing in Calgary. They had to shut down the exchanges, right? How damaging were the shutdowns to the Bitcoin currency ultimately?
Ultimately, I think several more will happen in the future. That's just my personal opinion.
More
I don't want
shutdowns.
to influence any speculations, but if it can happen once, it could happen twice. If it happens twice, it could happen 3 or 4 times. So that's the way people look at anything, whether it's a software situation, a hardware situation, whatever type of structure it might be. So there's a lack of confidence in that. And although the price has rebounded, just like we said a few seconds ago, it's over 691. It'll probably go over 700 tomorrow or so, or maybe even drop back. But still, there's still a lot of people doing this business, and there's a lot of people still mining. But whether or not we're going to have this conversation in March of 2015, I don't know. I think there's already some other instruments in the works.
Well, last time you were here, you kind of made the same prediction, that you thought, I forget that line you used, but it was a cute line. Something about the mouse and the cheese. And
oh yeah, well I said in business and marketing we always talk to students about first mover advantages. You know, and the classic example is McDonald's, right? But in the last couple of years Subway has come along because Subway is now growing faster than McDonald's for a different strategy. They're smaller stores and a smaller amount of operations, right? So the second mouse gets the cheese. The early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. And when we're dealing with IT structures, digital stuff can be copied and replicated almost seamlessly. So that's what makes it easy to think about the second mouse getting the cheese.
But when you were here a year ago, you were already predicting Bitcoin was potentially on its last legs, and they're still around. So you want to meet again in March of 2015? And
not sooner. Let's say Christmas time.
You think they'll be done by Christmas?
Well, I don't think they'll be done by Christmas, but what I'm looking forward to is something come along in second place. Here's some things that Bitcoin doesn't have. Bitcoin is not associated with a branded consumer product or service. It's not Microsoft dollars. It's not a pimped up version of Canadian Tire money. I always thought that a digital currency like this would come from that place. There's also a number of different players. There's the handset manufacturers. There's also the banks themselves, the oligopoly of Canadian banks and the big American banks. There's also government agencies and non-governmental organizations. There's structures like the OECD and the World Bank and so on. They're all, you know, thinking on the outside of this. There's also the credit card companies that don't want to be sidebarred because they don't want some other structure to take away the fact that people use their credit card and charge the interest and so on and so on. So there's so many different players in this. And then in the background is the explosion in smartphones and superphones, and micropayments and payments using your smartphone for all types of digital structures. Can Bitcoin be a part of that continued growth? Or will Apple come in and say, just like Apple did with computers, oh, we're going to start making phones? If Apple started making a currency, can you imagine all those people that are very, very strong adherents to the 4 and the 5 and the 5C and the 5S, et cetera, they would adopt that en masse. So what I'm saying is, there's a lot of people looking at this situation. There's handset manufacturers, there's software companies, and Microsoft dollars, for example. Microsoft operates in so many countries around the world. If they came up with a currency like that, that's something that could be adopted.
But if I understand you, you're saying there are so many other institutions in our society that have a stake in Bitcoin failing. Are they trying to sabotage it?
I wouldn't go so far to say sabotage, because I think any structure like this may fail on its own. Of course, it can also succeed as well. I mean, there are a number of different currency structures that have succeeded in a very moderate way for decades and decades. Canadian Tire money is one perfect example. And they morphed from being just a pure physical bill to also Canadian Tire money accrued on your card. And they survived and weren't replaced by anything.
Do governments dislike Bitcoin because, I guess in a very real way, if you barter or you trade or you do your business in Bitcoin, you can, well, I should ask, can you avoid paying taxes in doing that?
Well, yeah, that's the question. Most national governments that are members of OECD talk about the economic sovereignty of their country based on the value of their currency. And it's a business position. So if your currency is low, you can export competitively. If your currency is high, you can import goods and people can have a good standard of living. Now, if a significant, not a minor, but if a significant part of the population starts using a currency that is not that of your country, then it creates a problem because it affects the economic policies that governments have. So you take your fiscal policy, which is taxation, you take your monetary policy, which is the money supply, And what does that do to your monetary policy if a significant part of the population are using it, digital cyber currency?
So they're beyond actually the reach of their governments to be able to influence people's behaviors.
Exactly.
Because,
now, if it's just people buying songs off iTunes, that's not a big thing. But if you start using it for very, very long-term structures like micropayments for a mass transit system, for example. Let's say a very large mass transit conglomerate decided to use Bitcoin as a currency. Say something like the 407 ETR, which is owned by a Spanish conglomerate, which then decides for all their ETR type structures around the world, they're going to use Bitcoin. That could be the kickstart for something that could have a big effect.
So under that scenario, it is possible that governments down the road might make these things illegal because they're so far beyond the reach of government.
Or try to find some rule or regulation to make it challenging for people to use that beyond a niche type of scenario.
Or get a piece of the action. Would they want to get in on this?
Well, the Canadian government tried to create a sort of a copy of this version, but it was more kind of a niche sort of situation.
What was that? I didn't hear about that.
I can't remember what it was called, the Maple coin or something. I'm not really sure. I can't remember. I mentioned it last time.
Okay.
Yeah.
If not, then, all right, you talked about the early bird getting the worm, but the second mouse getting the cheese.
Yeah.
If Bitcoin doesn't take, I mean, 80,000 transactions per day is not bad, but if something else does come along, do you know what that will be?
Not sure, but I'm fascinated to find out. What I'm fascinated to see is how the handset manufacturers are going to position themselves. Think about cameras in phones. If we were talking and having a discussion 11 or 12 years ago and I said to you, by the way, you can take a 12 megapixel picture on your phone, you'd say, well, what the heck for? Why would they do that? Because you can put it on social media. Why would I want to do that? So there's all kinds of FABs, features, advantages, and benefits that are coming along. And here's the reason why. It's market development, not market penetration. Right? So market penetration is you have 50% of the target market using your product and you grow to 60% and 70%. Can't do that. Let's take phones, for example, right? If you're TELUS, you can't get an increased percentage because those are Rogers and Bell customers. So what you do to make more money is market development. You get more money off your existing customers. So the handset manufacturers and the telcos will all think about Bitcoin as a way to make more money off their existing users. Just like letting them put cameras in phones, because then if they start taking pictures and sending the picture over the phone, they can charge them more for their bandwidth.
Can we pay you for this interview in Bitcoin instead of in dollars?
No, I'd rather just my parking fee and that's it.
Tim, it's always good of you to accept our invitations to come in and talk about this very complicated but very fascinating stuff that is really about the future of how we're going to trade with each other. Thanks so much. That's Tim Richardson, who teaches e-commerce at Seneca and U of T. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.